Great, thank you. My name is Vinal, Karania, and I'm a research manager at Age UK, and with my colleague David Richardson, who's program managed the topic we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about combining research and practice. We're focusing on this element of it, and we've kind of left the policy bit out for now, but we can pick that up in questions. And what we really want to do is use our pilot as a case study of some of the challenges around having research, turning into practice, and then taking that practice, learning from it, and taking it back into research. So I'm going to quickly just talk about Age UK. Age UK is the largest older people's charity in England and the UK. There's 150 partners in England, around 150 partners in England, and we're partnered in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Our vision is a world where everyone can love later life, and one of the ways we hope to achieve this is by alleviating loneliness amongst older people. It's a strategic priority for us in the next few years. So by 2021, we hope to contribute to alleviating loneliness, and we hope to have a better understanding of how it works in terms of preventing loneliness, but also combating it for older people who've got it. Now, why loneliness? We know loneliness can have a devastating impact on your quality of life. It's a very personal, a very profoundly personal issue that can make someone feel very miserable. It's a very miserable existence. People can lose their self-confidence, which makes it very difficult to build meaningful relationships, and that could make it harder for someone to kind of get their kind of self-worth up. And more contentiously, we know it's associated with physical and mental health issues. It could, in some circumstances, lead to people developing some health issues. In other cases, it could make it more difficult for them to manage their own conditions. And it carries a stigma. People still find it very difficult to admit that they're lonely. So in some cases, they don't recognize they're lonely. And even if they do, who do you go to? Who do you go to if you're lonely? And even if they know who to go to, how does an organization support them? What kind of works in this field? So what we wanted to do was a piece of research at the beginning of this. So with the campaign to end loneliness, we decided to do a piece of work which looked in depth at a number of kind of services and interventions that are going on to try and understand what works, or what has been at least looked at in terms of what works. And we talked to experts and leading figures in the field, and as a result of that, this report was published a few years ago, Promising Approaches to Reducing Loneliness and Isolation in Later Life. Within this report is a framework. That's a framework. Quite complicated, but people can look at that at their own leisure. But essentially what the framework does is sets out a number of interventions that people think will help alleviate loneliness. At Age UK, our network is really good at doing the kind of direct interventions and the gateway services. A lot of befriending stuff, a lot of transport related stuff, lots of different things and bobs. But when we looked at this framework, we thought the one thing we really don't know whether we're good at or what really works is the kind of foundation services. How do we reach lonely people? How do we identify lonely older people? Once we've identified them, how do we understand their loneliness? It's a very unique feeling. Each individual can feel lonely for a variety of different reasons. And so how do we unpick that for every individual? And once we've done that, how do we provide them with the support to actually start becoming, potentially reconnecting with others, alleviating that, rather than kind of just the simple things that we've been doing over time again and again, things like just befriending services, things like that. How do we move beyond that? So we decided to focus on this, and we decided to run a pilot to test these things. And so my colleague, David, is going to talk about our pilot, and then I'm going to come back and talk about some of the challenges around that, around evaluating that and the research behind it.
Hi, my name is David Richardson. I'm a program manager at Age UK, and it has been my privilege, and sometimes tensioned, to lead the delivery of our Testing Promising Approaches, TPOL. Language gets in the way of this and does tend to confuse people. And it has led to some interesting things along the way. As Vinal said, the framework, if I can manage to persuade this to go back, the framework shows us a very clear approach. It appears to be quite linear with foundation approaches, with our direct interventions fed by gateway services and structural enablers. And it appears to be nicely stratified. Unfortunately, practice isn't quite like that. And in fact, they're all interdependent, and we know that. In the olden days, when our partners identified someone that they thought was lonely, it was very simple. They were pointed at a lunch club or a social centre or an activity, and the thinking was that they simply needed company, job done. Well, no. And what we set out to do was to use the framework to say, what have we actually got to achieve? And we came out with 3 little words, which seem to be very simple: reach, understand, and support. Each of those is a minefield. During the programme, we helped over 1,000 older people, of whom we got reliable data, and I'm sure Vinal will talk about that later, on about half. And what we demonstrated very clearly was that for those who were often lonely or lonely some of the time, we made a huge difference, somewhere between 70 and 80% of their, 88 to 70% range showed that their loneliness had decreased. So what we did worked. We had 8 partners. Now, I would love to say this was a randomized controlled trial and that we had all sorts of safeguards in place. We didn't. We went out to 8 of our partners who we knew had expertise in delivering loneliness in different ways. All of them had particular interests, and many of them already had particular delivery ideas. So we didn't start with a clean slate. What we started off was with a co-production methodology, sharing ideas, pooling best practice, and it was an evolving system that as time went on. So again, all the research tenets were kind of, and this is about practice. This is about making it work. Those of you with any reasonable knowledge of geography will have noticed immediately that most of these are in the north. That Oxfordshire, good morning Paul, was the one in the south, but it was purely accidental. We didn't deliberately set out to geographically select areas. But as it happened, we got a good mix of rural and urban, so I think it's a fair test. As I said, all of them had some expertise, and we brought people together in April 15 to say, how can we sort this out? What do we really mean by reach, understand, and support? The real difficulty is that older people do not admit that they're lonely. They do not recognize loneliness. And if they come with a presenting condition to one of our partners, loneliness is never on the agenda. So actually finding lonely people is a challenge. Many of our partners rely on their traditional support. They know where people are so they can find them. But what we did was challenge that, and our colleagues in research developed loneliness heat maps, which you'll have read about, which help us to delineate areas where people are more likely to be lonely than not. Over time, the heat map has improved, and it's gone from lower super output areas, which frankly I didn't really understand, to actually with an overlay of postcodes, which I do. So it is a very practical tool. We didn't really know what made loneliness tick. So our partners worked on what we've generically called guided conversations to help to understand, a conversation that took that person on a journey to explore their own loneliness and help us to help them to find potential solutions. And they may not have been automatic. As we went on, the guided conversation became something of a poisoned chalice, not least because it led staff into very challenging areas emotionally. It meant that they had to be very supported to carry out that work. But we found that guided conversations have been hugely important in getting to grips with the real circumstances and helping people to move forward. The understanding of that loneliness is crucial before you can provide support. Our partners used a number of techniques to move that forward. We found that some of our partners weren't able to immediately generate the activity which would most suit that person. So we used befriending services of various sorts. We used telephone befriending. Some of our partners used our national call-in time service, which you may have heard about. That befriending was really important. Two of our partners, South Tyneside and Wirral, particularly used their befriending models to really good effect. And that's led us to some conclusions which you've seen in the report, that basically eyes on the ground is so important. Local networks, connectivity, working in collaboration with others, not in competition, and helping this network to support people. So reach, understand, and support have become something of a mantra for us. And I think the lessons that we've learned are really applicable to many of our other 150 odd partners around the country. Thanks, Vinal.
Okay, so David's talked about the program and some of the challenges around that. And so when we started this off, as David said, we hadn't started off as a research program. It was based on research and it was informed by research, but it was a pilot and it was designed around how can we best test some of these things. But there are a lot of practical challenges around that, and I'm going to pick on kind of three key challenges around this, because we all kind of know the ideal scenario is that services are designed at the same time that kind of the research underpinning is designed. So they kind of work together, they complement each other, and you do an iterative process. But the realities of this was it was a very fast-moving pace. We had to really kind of identify partners who were able to actually pick this up and had the resources to kind of test some of these things and were willing to. So we were slightly kind of constrained by that. So now we've talked about how the research informed the practice. I'm going to talk about how we went about doing some of the practices, what some of the challenges were, but how we've taken the practice and how we're going to do some research with it. So how we've kind of done the whole loop. The first challenge we had was every organisation, or the 8 partners, all started from slightly different places in their delivery models. Some had befriending services, some had transport services, some had what we call people eyes on the ground. So they had people in the community who worked with people such as pharmacists, doctors, cafes, so forth, other voluntary organisations, which was actually a rich opportunity. David talked about us not doing this as a randomised control trial, which is true, but having 8 pilots, which all started from slightly different perspective, we had a comparison group. We had real richness in there. We had 8 partners, some similar, some different, so we had the ability and the opportunity to actually test things across different things. So that was a great opportunity, but that led to some very unique challenges. All the partners had their local issues and local requirements, so it meant that there were quite different cultures in there, and trying to put some parameters around that research so we could compare across the piece was quite challenging. For example, one of the things we wanted to do was use the UCLA 3-item loneliness scale as a way of measuring loneliness. Now, some of the partners were able to take that on board and take those questions and ask those questions as written. some partners found resistance from their staff in terms of how to ask them. Some staff fed back saying they felt that these weren't appropriate for older people. Older people would find it difficult to answer these. So that caused us a number of issues around, how do we ensure questions are being asked in a way that we can compare across the piece. So that was a challenge. Then we had some real practical challenges around data. In an ideal situation, we would have been able to define the whole data set that we wanted, have it in place and have a clear idea of how we were going to use all that data. But different partners collected different data. Even if they collected the same data, they used different categorization. And they all had, well, not all of them, some of them had different databases, which meant that there was a challenge in terms of, even if we could capture the data, how do we bring it together and how do we analyze it? So there were some issues around that data. So what we did, we were able to come together and we did identify a set of data that we would all collect, but which meant there was a large amount of data that ideally as a researcher you'd want to be able to try and understand and unpick this, that we weren't able to do. So that was some of the practical issues we had to kind of face around this. The second practicality was around this being a pilot, and with 8 partners having different experiences, doing different things, they were all sharing their learning as they were going along. They were picking things up, they were meeting, they were sharing that, and they were adapting their models. So for example, one of our partners were asking the loneliness questions over the phone to older people they were supporting, and they found that was quite tricky because older people weren't very receptive to speaking to some people who they didn't really know. That kind of channel of engagement wasn't really working, whereas other partners in the program were doing it face-to-face, and that found it kind of more useful. So they adapted their program to try and do it face-to-face. That was one of many changes which happened as the pilot was going along. And that introduced an interesting issue for us. Models were being changed, delivery methods were being changed, so we were seeing impact, but how much of that impact was because of the delivery models, how much of the delivery models was being influenced by the impact they were seeing, and that kind of cyclical nature. So we weren't always able to unpick what was really driving the change. It was only a 15-month pilot, so there was a lot of learning, which really raises questions around, if we're doing pilots in real situations, in real settings, what is that length of time that we really need to be able to come to something where people are pretty confident in the delivery method and the kind of processes and working, and therefore the kind of changes you see are going to be as a result of that kind of delivery and not be influenced by things that are changing. But things will always change, and that's the kind of issue we're going to have. And what that's led to is, how do we take this learning and the results, and how do we apply it wider across our network and others? What does it mean? Where is it appropriate? Where is it applicable? Our last challenge, and a challenge I think which sits with a lot of individuals and a lot of organizations in the third sector, is this challenge of attribution. To what extent can we be comfortable that the changes we observe are as a result of our program? Like David said, for those who are often lonely, 88% of those had a reduction in their loneliness score. That's a huge number. For those who were somewhat, that was 70-odd%, so quite large numbers. But how do we prove that? We didn't do this as a randomized controlled trial, but we still want to ensure that we're comfortable around this. So what can we do? We decided to measure it between 6 weeks. We decided to measure the change at a base, and 6 weeks after, what was the change in the score. We're hoping a small time scale might indicate that there's less of the other kind of influences happening. It ended up being 6 to 12 weeks because of the practicalities on the ground. People said 6 weeks. Sometimes it took 4 or 5 weeks to get something in place for these individuals. Therefore, we said 6 to 12 weeks. And we did see reductions of the amounts we talked about. But can we be comfortable that they were due to our service? We hope they were, and we wanted to do some regression analysis to try and control for some of the other factors based on the data we had. But actually, that's going to be a challenge across the piece. How can you control for all the factors, and what are the key factors to control for in these groups of individuals? Changes in medication, changes in social care support. All these things could happen unexpectedly. How do we capture that in our data? If we don't have it in our data, what do we do? It is a real challenge for us. We're comfortable and we're confident that our services are having an effect, and we're trying to be creative by collecting other types of data and try and triangulate the data, but we still get still a big pushback from some individuals saying actually it's not a randomized control trial or quasi-experimental trial, or you haven't really controlled for this, that, the other. It's the challenge of doing something in real settings. There is no kind of perfect way of doing this. If you really want to provide something that is a legacy for our partners have taken this on board and are continuing with it. The pilot ended, they've taken the learnings and they're going with it. So a success for us, but have we been able to demonstrate it? So many challenges, but many opportunities. We took this learning and we've got some other work streams happening now. The challenge around asking questions, we took that on board and said, how can people have a conversation? What we in AGK term guided conversation. How can we have that conversation? So we want to do a piece of work to try and understand what training do people need, what support do they need. A lot of it's out there, so this is not kind of doing new work, but it's kind of gathering that through from people who've been able to do this and trying to formulate or put into something that can help people. Do some people need emotional support? Some of it's very challenging for people, some of the feedback. The other thing we're trying to do is the data. How can we make the most of the data? How can we get people to understand that data is useful? We're not just collecting it for the sake of collecting it. So we're trying to think of, can we create a dashboard which is live? So as people collect data and they input it, things change. And it gives everyone what they need. It may not give all the answers, but it gives a way of people to understand what's happening. And the third thing we're thinking of is understanding we have lots of services, like David was talking, the framework is quite broad, lots of different services, and because the framework is around person-centered support, different people would need different types of support. But can we do some work to try and understand whether certain types of services are more beneficial to certain types of individuals? So we want to try and understand whether there are ways of trying to categorize types of loneliness or personalities or whatever it is. Is there a way of doing this? So that's three kind of work streams which came from this. So that's a really useful example for us where we've taken some research, used it into practice and taking that learning and trying to convert it back into research. So how I'm going to end. There's some negatives there, but there is no such thing as a perfect research. We can do what many people want us to do. We could have done a randomized control trial. We could do quasi-experimental trials. We could do a number of different things. But there will always be issues with whatever we do. So we are always thinking about this. How can we do something which is practical to people? How can we take something, learn from it, give it to people, let them go with it, learn from it and go with it. So never going to be such a thing as a perfect research, but actually that doesn't matter. For us it's about being realistic, being pragmatic and being challenging. And I think that's the key which came from this pilot. This was one of our first pieces of work where we've really challenged ourselves and said, is what we're doing working? We've been doing lots of stuff for a number of years. Is it really working? And a number of partners have picked this up. As an example, one of our partners hadn't done a befriending service. They had kind of stopped it. They thought actually it creates dependency and so forth. As part of this learning, they've said actually there is value for befriending service. And they've created something which they think will work for themselves, a 3-step process where for some people befriending service may be the only thing that will be beneficial for them because they may not be able to get out, they may be housebound, things like that. But they've got layers of stuff so they see it as a way of trying to get people back engaged with the community. So that's kind of where we're trying to move towards, trying to do something practical, use research to try and inform the practice, but then use the practice to try and inform the research so that we're always learning. And we're trying to do it in a real setting, which brings us challenges, like I said. But it's been I think we've been a successful thing and we've learned to learn, we want to move that forward. So yeah, there we go. A positive to end on.